In the fall of 2012, Gearbox and 2K released a sequel to their open-world first-person shooter RPG. This game's quirky style gave designers a greater means of communication with their audience. Cell shading and dingy off-colors meant more freedom in highlights and cues. The game also doesn't take itself too seriously and often parodies other works, so if something unusual needs to be added to improve gameplay, it can be without damaging the game's sense of style. In the creation of any game, level designers always have to think about ways to tell the gamer how to successfully play the game. This can't be too subtle or players will get frustrated and stop playing. Conversely, it can't be too obvious or the player's sense of reward for overcoming a challenge is diminished. The game itself uses common elements to keep the player aware of what they should do. We can see traditional radar in the corner, used on first-person shooters for decades, and also included in some modern role-playing games, so it makes perfect sense to see it here. A diamond in the radar floats into the game screen to show players their objectives, which are also highlighted with a greenish emissive color. The game uses green to signal the player quite often. We can see these piles of scrap on the ground have a green stink wafting above them, and every lootable container has a similar green color somewhere on it, which disappears once the object has been looted. When the missions are laid back, that seems to be where the cues end. Follow the arrow, kill the bad guy, get the loot. Even notice here where we are expected to follow this robot. The light on the tip of his antenna is very similar to the color that is intended to attract us to loot. Perhaps this was a coincidence, or it was intentional. In the original Borderlands, the antenna was still green, but a shade further from the loot highlight, so it seems reasonable they dialed this in to keep players' attention. As mentioned earlier, the game tries to go beyond the typical game-player interactions. Here, the player has to fight their way up a fortress. Players are given instructions the same way as before, however this time, props in the level itself seem to be talking to the player. It's not uncommon to build clues subtly into the background. However, these large red arrows are far from subtle. It's possible the extreme drop in subtlety is due to the extra action in the scenes. The enemies give the players more distraction, so there are more cues to compensate. The University of Texas in Austin and Ohio State University conducted experiments which suggest gamers don't remember in-game ads as often when they're performing a lot of violent acts. Perhaps in-game instruction hits this same obstacle. This idea is supported when we think back to another famous game.
This is not the correct direction. If you do not follow me, you may become lost.
Bungie's first installment of Halo used arrows to remind players which door they entered and which one they should leave through. Halo is an exceptional example for in-level directions because 10 years later the game was remade and the developers seemed quite aware players were still getting lost. Not only do these new arrows appear brighter against their surroundings, but another level, the library, originally left players to explore on their own. Many got lost and flooded message boards with complaints, so in the remake, that level too got this extra guidance. Because Borderlands and Halo have obvious arrows, and both are rated M for violence, it sounds like developers do drop subtlety to overcome violent distractions. But 2011 was a popular year for remakes. Aside from Halo, we have another example of N-level arrows which make the ladders feel almost invisible. And the violence of that game? Not zero, but not far from it. In the original Zelda, Ocarina of Time, players had to remember which passages would take them from the Water Temple's main chamber to one of 3 specific switches which would change the water level, an integral mechanic for solving puzzles. This led many gamers down the wrong passages, and all of this unnecessary backtracking created enough frustration to land the game in the number 2 position of a popular ranking site's list of most confusing video game levels. In the remake, the level has arrows at the ends of long lines of light which pulse in the intended direction of travel. In addition to these arrows, some passageways are even given signs, letting the player know where they should go without the need for exploration. So where does that leave Borderlands and its big red arrows? Zelda's child-friendly rating leads me to believe that they are not intended to get a message through a torrent of violence and emotion. And these are all different games. Each one has its own art style which could sway what cues look like irrespective of violence. Even within Borderlands, its non-violent areas are also given a great deal of instruction. For example, in this stage, the player is intended to crash a car into a pipe. We can see a lot of the usual green, as well as plumes of purple smoke, and a red sign to capture our attention. This is also ignoring the non-visual cues, like another character telling us exactly what we need to do. So let's reconsider the red arrows. This particular stage is very linear. The player simply fights their way across each platform to a ramp leading up to the next platform. Because of the lack of choice, obvious cues like these are not intended as instruction. It's not important for the player to remember that they saw a cue to ascend. Instead, it's likely that these are here to encourage the player to go faster. They see the arrow and they go. No waiting for their shield to recharge, no sorting their inventory, just go as fast as they can. It's also true that the last arrow is just in front of the last group of enemies before a natural resting point, further increasing the idea that the game uses these obvious cues not as instruction of where to go, but to encourage the pace of getting there. So all of these excessive cues aren't trying to get a message to the player through all the violence. Instead, they are likely intended to enhance the rate of violence and action that the player experiences. Thank you for watching, and thank you to everyone I ripped off in the making of this video.